So the story of Jonah has a lot of interesting symbolic and psychological implications for our lives. It's a very fascinating story. I mean, it's definitely one of those stories that has permeated culture. I mean, everybody knows the story. Everybody's heard of the story. I mean, at least the part of him being swallowed up by a whale. And so I just wanted to take a look at some of the overarching messages that we can find in that story when it comes to do with our responsibility and what happens when we run away from responsibility. So um, I'll call this one Jonah and the pursuit of her hedonic or hedonistic impulses. And so we have this story, and it starts with this character Jonah, who to many, this could be the first time they're encountering him, but really, he's no new character. This Jonah character has been referenced before, and his reference before has been that of a prophet, and so he's not um, he's not new to the idea of God calling him and giving him instructions on things that he needs to do. This is not the first time, and you can kind of get the sense from reading some of the old references to him that he's gone through with that which he was called to do before. And so in this story, you find an individual who has had a record of doing the things that he has been called to do and now going into a different direction. And to some degree we can all sort of relate to that, to the regard that there are things that we have been called upon to do in our past, that we have fulfilled those duties and we fulfilled those callings, but now we've encountered new callings that sometimes um, we struggle to be able to achieve or arise and go to them as Jonah is called to do because of some reason. There's always a reason, and we can look in the reasons for Jonah. But it's interesting. You kind of have this. Um, you have a lot of these Hebrew parallelisms in this story, and a lot of these patterns, and it's interesting to look. So the first thing that you have is the word of the Lord came unto Jonah, and so Jonah has been tasked with something, and that something is what is going to come up next. And so he is told to arise and go to Nineveh, the great city, and cry against it, for the wickedness has come up before me. And so there's this idea, which is very much referenced in the Bible, of things coming up to God. And so you have this starting with the Cain and Abel story. In the Cain and Abel story, you have that God saying to Cain, the blood of your brother cries out to me from the ground. And so with that, you know that these are analogies, these are ways of trying to explain something. And so you see it in this story, but you also see it in other stories where it says that this cry went up to God, or the wickedness has reached the heavens. It's more of a way of explaining how something has been um, has has expanded in its evil, and also the magnitude of that which it is, and there's the idea that God is paying attention to it. And so you have that in this story, and he is told to arise and go to Nineveh. But Jonah arose, or he rose up to flee unto Tarshish. So you have the calling, which is get up and go to this place. And he hears that, but he gets up and goes to a different place. And of course, relatably, like we've been in that experience before. We've been in those situations where we have been called upon to do a specific task, and we decided to go into a different direction. And the question is, which direction are we going to? Because seemingly it seems that there is only two directions one can go: towards the goal, towards the calling, or away from the calling. And so here you have that he rose up to flee, so away to Tarshish. And so this place is introduced, this Tarshish place, and it's interesting without the full um, backstory on Tarshish, but it's important to note that Tarshish is this Edenic type place. It's this place that was being constructed by not just Solomon but others, where there was all types of pleasures, and it was an escape, right? And so we can kind of think about that into some sort of extent, which is that, when and we can relate to that, especially in the West. I mean, when we have vacation time, what do? We most often than not everybody, but sometimes people either go on a quest to find themselves on these vacation periods, or they will go into this pursuit of this Edenic place, right? And so we'll go to this beautiful place where the sun is always shining, and there's beautiful exotic animals and exotic food. And that is trying to escape from the callings that are before you. And you can reason with that to say, there is a lot of um, constant demands upon us, and so to take a break, to be able to do something different, is nothing that is uncalled for. And not necessarily saying that it's not, but it's a way of conceptualizing that idea. And so, Jonah, instead of going towards the difficulty, the task, he's going away to this place of pleasure, right? He is, instead of chasing, or not necessarily chasing, but instead of pursuing the path of difficulty, he will go into the the pursuit of his hedonic impulses, and it's escapism, right? That's what Jonah's trying to do. The calling comes, and now it's time for me to get away from this, escape. And so we find that this is exactly what he does, and so it's referenced many times. So he arose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. And so, you know um, there is there's this idea here, and it's almost comedic in some ways if you think about it, because the authors of the Bible say, well, he rose to flee from the presence of the Lord, and the question to ask yourself, well, if this is God, then how could one flee from God? It's not, in a sense, it's not possible to flee from the presence of, but in a sense it is. And so the moving away from achieving the goals and the calling that one is placed upon them is in essence fleeing from the presence of the Lord. And you will feel the ramifications of that. And what happens when we do something like that? Well, you know typically we bring chaos, and we bring a lot of people down with us. And it's no coincidence that we see that in the story as we go forward. And it says, but the Lord sent a great wind into the sea, and there was a mighty tempest in the sea, so that the ship was like to be broken. And so there's this idea here that, and this, we're not going to look at this today, but there's this idea that people are like ships in this world. And they're on the sea, and it's tempestuous, and there's all these different things, and it's supposed to be symbolic of the difficulties and in the struggles and the temptations that one individual may experience in their lifetime. And of course, there is two ways one may respond to such situations, right? And everybody's going to encounter these situations. It's just a matter of, what do you do? And so typically, when you run away from those callings, the things of responsibility, the things of greatest responsibility that are before us, what ends up happening is that you bring up about a tempestuous situation. The seas start to roar, and you feel psychological distress, and there is a lot of different feelings. It's the humans are described sometimes when we're going through these psychological states as a ship in a sea being tossed to and fro, right? And so this is what Jonah is experiencing literally, and it's supposed to be symbolic of something more spiritual or psychological. And so you have that, you know, what happens? Well, what happens when you run away from the things that you are called upon to do? Well, typically we bring a lot of people into our chaos. And so that's generally what happens, especially in familiar circles, or we see that, um, we pass on, we have these generational traumas and things that have been unresolved. And it's not necessarily that they're genetic, it's that the environment in which those people are being raised in. It's the same environments because we keep passing that thing forward. And so what happens is that an individual will sort of take themselves out of that situation and decide that they will no longer allow the same thing to encompass everyone else, and try to break a circle of these um, um, well, generational traumas, if you will. And so we bring people down, we bring people into our chaos, right? And so then you have the mariners were afraid and cried every man unto his god. And there's some allusions there to the idea, well, I mean, it's lowercase god is lowercase g, so there's this idea in the Bible that there is no other gods, but for people, gods are the gods of their own making. And so what is that going to tell you? Well, it's going to tell you that they're going to probably act out in their own capabilities and their own strength to be able to save themselves from the situation that they're in. And well, what happens is that every man to his god, and cast forth the wares that were in the ship into the sea to lighten it. And so um, but Jonah was gone down into the sides of the ship, and he lay and was fast asleep. And so here you're introduced to this idea that you kind of see in the New Testament, which is especially, well, you see it explicitly in the Gospels with Jesus. Is it's like he's on a boat too, and he's with his disciples, and the storm comes, and the sea is raging again. So it tells you two things. Well, the first thing it tells you is that it's going to come to everybody. Even the least deserving individual is going to have to face some of these storms and be on this kind of roller coaster, if you will. And nobody's immune to it, because that's what happens in this world when there is chaos, and its chaos is all around us. And so there's two responses. See, in the gospel account, Jesus is sleeping during that whole encounter, and you say, well, how could one be sleeping through such chaos? Well, if you come to an understanding in your life that chaos and troubles and temptations are part of the process of growth, and it's part of the process that one must go through as one lives life, then what will happen is you will be easy and restful, in the sense knowing that what will happen. And even greater, and even greater to that is, well, I mean, for Jesus, it was the idea that he knew God was in control. And so there's this motif in AA, which is, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. You cannot change these things that are going to happen. But then it says, but the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference, because there is times in our lives that we bring storms upon ourselves. And this is the perfect example here with Jonah. But there are times where storms just come because that's the way it is. And so what an individual wants to know is that ability to differentiate between the two. And so the shipmaster came to him and said unto him, what meanest thou, O sleeper? Arise. Again, the story begins with arise, and here is this shipmaster, explicitly this heathen, if you will, in some sense, to Jonah at least, and he's telling him arise. Sometimes there are people that come into our lives that are the least expecting people that say, hey, you should arise, just like the first calling was. It's, what are you doing? And so arise and call upon that God, and be so that God will think upon us that we perish not. And so, and here's where we get to, and there's so much in the story. We're just kind of going fast very quickly, and we're not even going to get to the last chapters, which are packed full of symbolic, psychological implications. But and they said, everyone to his fellow, come and let us cast lots, that they may know for whose cause this evil has come upon us. It's like, well, someone is responsible for this. Someone has not done. And sometimes we think about these ancient characters and these ancient people, and we think how primitive they were, in some sense, that their belief that, oh, well, someone did something wrong to their gods, and so that's why this is upon us. And you think, well, that's silly, but the fact of the matter is that there is truth to that, to the degree that they understood something fundamentally, which is, you know, it is possible that this is happening because someone is running away from some called upon responsibility from something greater than them, and it's not something to scoff at. It is something to take note at, because this is very true. And so they said unto him, Tell us, we pray thee, for whose cause this evil is upon us? What is thine occupation, and whence comest thou? What is thy country, and what people art thou? And so there's a lot of questions that are being thrown to Jonah, and this is a time. And so what I like this in the story, because it's what happens is that sometimes when we're going through these moments in our lives where we have confused ourselves, or we found ourselves confused as to what our calling was and what our purpose was and the direction that we were going, that some people come and ask us questions. And these questions are meant to help us reflect upon what our calling is, and the responsibility that we should be taking upon ourselves. And so, and he said unto thee, I am and Hebrew, and I fear the Lord Yahweh, the God of heaven, which has made the sea and the dry land. And we won't get into this, but there's a reason why there's a reference to the sea and the dry land, and they're symbolic. And I mean, right now he's in the sea, and pay close note that after this, the fish spits him out into the dry land, and so there's some deep meaning there, but. And the men were exceedingly afraid, and they said unto him, Why hast thou done this? Why are you here? For the men knew that he fled from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. And see, there was this belief back then that you do not run away from that which is calling you, that is coming from the highest, calling you to something, to calling you to do something. Whether we look at it differently today, and we have different things that we find that are calling, or careers are calling upon us, or whatever that may be. But there are calls that are even greater than that, and there are people who have fulfilled those calls, and we think very highly of those people throughout history. And so and so um, they said unto thee, What shall we do unto thee, that the sea may be calm unto us? For the sea wrought and was tempestuous. And you think about, it's going to foreshadow something in the Gospels. It's very interesting, but I mean, you think about the fact that Jonah basically says, "Just kill me, because if I disappear and if I die," and it's a foreshadow to the further of the story, because at the end of the story, he's asking to be killed. And does he has no expectation that some great fish is going to take him and spit him out into the land. But there's this idea that, you know, which you'll find later on in the Gospels here, is that, well, you must throw me into, you must throw me into the death, if you will. You must throw me into the consequences of my decisions. It's the idea of when people say I've hit rock bottom, right? It's like, when you hit rock bottom, for a lot of people, especially when we think about things from an addiction standpoint, rock bottom is can be a blessing a lot of the times, because it is that rock bottom. And so people sometimes are afraid that they'll never hit that bottom, because then they think that they'll never stop. But it's that bottom that really points people to realize what is going on. And sometimes you're hurled into that to be able to experience that. And you can see, um, continuing on, so they took Jonah and cast him forth into the sea, and the sea ceased from her raging. And so then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and offered a sacrifice unto the Lord, and made vows. And so now you have that this great fish swallowed up Jonah, and he was in there for 3 days and 3 nights. And this prayer that Jonah has afterwards, which is, it's very interesting, but it's like Jonah finds himself in the deeps of the ocean. He finds himself in the lowest point, and it's very symbolic that he's all the way down at the bottom of the ocean. And it's like the idea that, when you don't do that which you've been called upon to do, you're going to find yourself really, really deep in the bottom. And you're going to be at rock bottom. You're going to reach the darkest place. And when you're there is when most people experience that level of humility that they ask for help. And of course, that is what Jonah does. Jonah asks for help and he recognizes his condition and his state and he says, help me. And then the fish spits him out into dry land. But it's it's very descriptive of this idea that he's in Sheol, Hades, and we have this conceptualization of hell for that terminology. But I mean, that's just more pop culture, if you will, our view of hell. But Sheol is considered the place of death. It's the darkest place, and just to tie a bow around this in the gospel, you have this idea that Jesus must throw himself into death in order for him to save people from death. And that's the Jonah story because except except he does it willingly and Jonah does it unwillingly. And so that's the struggle in our lives. It's like, well, you can either suffer for good and there will be something great at the end, or you can suffer for evil and stretch out your level of suffering. You will experience suffering. No one is immune from it, but you can suffer for different reasons. And so um, there are a lot of things that we can learn from the story of Jonah.